Welcome to the first episode of the Haifa Wave podcast, hosted by Tony Wukovitsky. In each episode, we'll feature a guest from around the world who shares their unique perspectives on current events and their experiences of life in their corner of the globe. Together, we'll explore topics like culture, politics, and occasionally, philosophy. For this debut episode, our guest is Mims, a former classmate of Tony's from Haifa University, now living in Amsterdam. So sit back, relax, and get ready. Here we go.
Hi, Mims. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure for me to see you as well. I think that we haven't much seen each other since the university yet. Like it was like very long time ago.
Long time ago, pre-COVID. Yeah,
Yeah.
it feels like a lifetime ago at this point. Yeah.
It's true. It's true. The time is passing by very, very fast. I would love you to introduce yourself to our audience, so they will know a little bit more about you.
Sure. Well, I'm Mims. I'm 35, an Israeli who has moved to the Netherlands. I've been here almost 6 years. I work in advertising. That's my day job. But in my creative outlets are cultural, poetry, literature. So I write and publish poetry in Hebrew, in Israel. And I also edit an online literary journal in Hebrew called Ararat, which focuses on existential literature, existential creation, rather. So I spend a lot of time thinking about things.
Yeah. It feels about right. And you basically moved to Netherlands from Israel how long ago?
6 years ago. Almost
6 years ago. Yeah, that's a long time. And how was your moving experience from the beginning?
It's a good question. Well, I moved to the Netherlands for love, so I didn't necessarily fantasize about living in the Netherlands or in Amsterdam. But I had met my partner, who is also Israeli, but has lived here for many years. And so I eventually made the move. I think it's always difficult to move outside of your home country and your culture, even when you do it for the right reasons and you're not escaping something, but, going to a person, and with that also enjoying, someone whose life is established here. So a lot of the pains of migration have been sort of ironed out for me. Yeah. But still, there always is adjustment. There always is an unavoidable level of alienation from your surroundings, because you're starting from scratch. You're building a social network from scratch. You're not necessarily sure what your value in the workplace is yet.
Yeah.
And so that also takes time. But, I think a good word of advice for anyone who has moved or is considering moving to anywhere. Early on, someone told me that it takes between 3 to 5 years to really start feeling at home in a new place. That has definitely been my experience. So for me, 3 years on the mark, started feeling like home in the Netherlands.
So that's interesting, because what you describe is more difficulty in the beginning compared to because I think that you could really kind of divide the experience of moving to, at least from my experience, like to two types. That either you have like this honeymoon stage where you, from the beginning, you're like, oh my God, I love it here, like it's so much better from the place that I left, and you have the experience that you're like the other way around. You're like, oh, it's so different. I actually miss my old place, and like, so you went more from the first type, you would say, or like it's mixed.
I think it was always ambivalent. I
Uh,
mean, there are a lot of advantages to living in the Netherlands if you come from Israel.
mhm,
Respect for private time is a big
yeah.
one. Peace and quiet, mostly, is a big one.
Mhm.
Accessibility to nature and greenery. And if, like me, you really suffer from 40-degree weather,
Oh,
then, I prefer to have it slightly gloomy year round.
ah,
Because you can actually be more active outdoors and do more.
yeah. You
So
and me both. I also,
yeah, so it was always ambivalence. It wasn't
yeah.
the other.
I wonder if it's an Ashkenazi thing, maybe, like, like generations over generations. It's like like you're like also Eastern European origin, more or less, or like Western European something.
Yeah, genetically Ashkenazi Jewish,
Yeah.
but culturally a bit of a mix because my father was born in London and my mother was
Oh,
in Chicago. Uh,
wow.
and of course, I was born and raised in Israel. So
Hmm.
a lot of Western influences.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just wondered about it because, okay, I don't know how much is it connected specifically to like the origin, let's say, because I know people who are like Ashkenazi and who like sunny weather all the time and all
Mm,
that. But I remember like traveling like abroad and like for the first time, like I mean I was born in Belarus basically, but I grew up in Israel and all that, and you know,
Let's be
so
honest, Tony, not many people thrive at 40-degree weather. You don't have
yeah.
to be Ashkenazi or not to say, you know what, this is a bit much. Tone it down, son.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So,
It reminds me. It reminds me like there was this case that my friend went to visit me when I was on student exchange in Poland, and like he flew on the plane from Israel to Warsaw, from Tel Aviv to Warsaw, and there was like this family, like they were speaking in Hebrew, but it was a mother and a child, and the child like speaks like it's clearly the child was born in Israel, but and he speaks to the mother. Oh, and the plane was like it was connection in Ukraine, so they changed like flight. It was before the war and everything. And the child says to his mother, "He's like like in perfect Hebrew, like fluent Hebrew, all that. It's like finally we're leaving this country. I'm suffering for years from this like hot weather." And like the child is like what, like I don't know, like six, like four or five, I don't know, like very very little child anyway, at least by what my friend described it, like very little, and he's like, for years I'm suffering. How many years could you be like?
it made an impression. It made a lasting impression on this
Yeah,
young boy's mind.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, most of my friends and most of the people like get depressed from this kind of weather. I'm like, I really when I went to the gloomy weather of Warsaw, I was like, it's chilly. It's like, I mean, winter is hell, yeah. But like, I mean, when you're not indoors, but like
Tony, is this a podcast about weather?
it- well, I think that it could be a side topic, but you're right. We could focus more on like let's go back to the main lane.
Agenda, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think the weather is like like it's like it's a very important thing
Yeah,
culturally.
a lot of Dutch people, it really is their go-to. They complain so much about their
Oh.
own weather, right?
Hmm.
And for me, I'm always like, sorry, can't relate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess so, but I think that this is another difference between like Europe and Israel that I at least felt like culturally. And tell me if it's true, like because like like the weather is really a thing, right? Like I mean, in the sense that there aren't like such like life or death issues that you like you can spend, at least my experience, maybe it's like different, like like in Netherlands when I was like in Warsaw, when I was like in Greece, like with some exceptions, like you can spend a lot of time not
Mhm.
hearing the news, like nobody will, because in Israel somebody will comment, oh, you heard like that and this and then so on and so on and so on, right?
It also comes down to control, because if you live in a country like Israel, there's so much you can't control, which is the internal politics and divisions, security threats,
Yeah.
public opinion. Outside of Israel, like there's so much that is outside of the realm of your control. Whereas if you live in a mostly peaceful, thriving European country, then the things outside of your control are perhaps, the schedule of the garbage pickup and the weather. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. That's true. That's a thing that is culturally like very, very different. And like I kind of like I think like kind of liked it before. I think also like the thing is that like not knowing something in Europe, like it's not a matter of life and death, because in Israel you could like literally like know like miss something important about where it's more dangerous right now, like I don't know, stuff like that, warnings about certain stuff, like, and so
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. Though, the flooding in Spain just a couple of weeks ago teaches
All
us that
right.
maybe that's also changing.
Yeah, yeah. Natural disasters, but like I mean, like it's not very common, right? Like overall, like
Yeah.
so. And like, what else did you find like different, like like in the culture that it was hard for, or maybe easier for you to like feel connected?
Um, I think there's a lot of really great things about living in the Netherlands. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking, the Dutch are also very open
Mm-hmm.
and very, perhaps the word is accepting. There is a lot of freedom
Mm-hmm.
overall, I think, in Dutch society. There's a lot of space to be your own person and have your own interests and cultivate them. Um, Whereas in a culture like Israel, which is, in a warmer climate in many ways, uh, it feels, at least, that people are a lot more in each other's business.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, and there's not much respect for personal space, personal time. Your business is everyone's business, and everyone feels
Yeah,
entitled to comment, uh,
yeah,
about your life and your opinions and your feelings and what you're doing. And
yeah.
the Netherlands, that's not really the case. There is historically a culture of, uh, shall we say, social supervision. I think
Mm.
that also comes from the history of the country, the more religious parts of the country, I feel.
Mhm.
Um, which is to say that the Dutch feel very comfortable also correcting you when you're wrong, or you get something wrong about their habits or
Oh.
conventions or societies. Foreigners often describe, getting a mini lecture from a stranger on the street, or their boss, or someone who,
That's
in
much.
the Netherlands, we do so and so, or, we follow
Oh,
kind of, and it's not meant to be arrogant, even though some people consider it arrogant.
yeah.
It's really seen as a way to help you integrate and do better, and also, in a way, maybe not embarrass yourself next time, right? If you did
Uh,
something wrong. So there is this culture of like social supervision,
uh-huh.
which perhaps doesn't quite match this highly individualistic liberal society.
Hey, interesting.
But it's not the only contrast about living in the Netherlands. So
Hmm. I like it's interesting because like I didn't like notice this in other countries that have been in Europe, and of course like each country has their own things. It's like it is an interesting thing, but specifically about the part of I think it's like it's good outweigh for like this, as you said, like individualism and also like basically personal space, because like I did feel like whether it was like in France, whether it was in Poland as well, lesser so I guess in Greece, but like in the sense that there is way more, but even in Greece to a certain extent, like separation between like outside, indoors and outdoors, like your behavior. And I remember like sitting with friend and other friend from Israel, and we were discussing about how like there is no such separation. Like people behave in Israel like the way like you can go like you can go to a guy like random guy on the street and say like bro like like so and so, and the other way around. Sometimes it's like annoying that somebody like comes to you and like begins to speak to you like he knows you, and there is certain like thing, especially in France, like Poland and so on, that they would be like stir or like like kind of like
There's
more
no
respectful.
formality. Yeah, it's true. Israel is not known for being a very uh, uh, for loving formality.
Yeah.
That's also a very attractive point for many people who, like my parents, were born outside of Israel.
Hmm.
Um, so it's true. There is, I suppose, an adjustment for Israelis moving outside of the country. For me, there wasn't so much that adjustment because of my own family's background.
Uh-huh.
Um, I guess the biggest difference is for me as an Israeli walking around, and living in Amsterdam. And I think especially in the past year or so, with everything that's going on in the world,
Uh-huh.
I sort of discovered that um, every Israeli has a mini activist inside them. I think we're very used to giving our opinion
Uh-huh.
and making our case, and we do this out of habit in
Uh-huh.
conversation with friends. We're used to discussing and polishing um, our opinions, and so
Mhm.
it's very different when you then come to a society that is highly individualistic,
Mhm.
but also doesn't expect that.
Mhm.
There is a lot of rule following.
Mhm.
So you're not expected to necessarily have an opinion that's in opposition to anything.
Mhm.
Um, you wouldn't necessarily know how to make the best case for why
Mhm.
you think the way you think, in the same manner that Israelis and perhaps Jews uh,
Yeah.
just do almost intuitively.
Mhm.
And that's sometimes difficult to fully mitigate the idea that you're not surrounded by activists.
Mhm.
Uh, and perhaps you're alone, uh, you know, you're the sole activist.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. I had like there is some sort of experience, even though I always try like most of the time to really separate between myself. I was trying to kind of hey, like uh, I'm not representing Israel, like, but it somehow like always thought like it almost felt like I need to, like people expect me to, and it was a bit kind of like it's the feeling is that like our existence, at least, okay, I will talk about myself, like my existence as an Israeli, like this, like
Mhm.
just stating the identity, not stating my political stance, is a political kind of saying, okay, even though I don't want it to be like a political saying, and I can understand why would people think that, but I really think that I mean, uh, like even if they disagree with what led to the creation of Israel, like the country exists for 70 years. Like people who live there and culturally grew up there, they don't choose their identity, even if they say like, oh, it's legitimate and so on and so on. But then we can speak about the illegitimacy of other like societies, uh, like like American society, like I don't know, Australian society, even like Turkish society, which is also based on a lot of violence and a lot of like kind of like not the most pleasant history into treating the people who live there originally.
I don't know any society that began,
Mhm.
on a bed of roses, right? I don't think
Mhm.
that's how countries are made. But it's interesting, just to kind of go back to your previous point. You mean when you're in conversation with people outside of Israel,
Mhm.
you feel like you're like they're automatically expecting you to take a kind of, let's say, pro-Israeli or whatever kind of
Yeah.
position and represent the country you're from,
Yeah.
and that's just their expectation. And yeah,
Yeah. I mean, like if we look at like from this perspective, I think like
would you expect a Dutch person to explain Dutch society to you, or
uh,
would you be
uh, exactly that's the question. Like because I feel it like I actually like would way more compare Israelis to like in this case to Americans because I think that like first of all a lot of criticism of people who tend to criticize Israel is because like also along other things is like the alignment, this kind of this crowd of like we're anti-imperialists, but in fact they're anti-imperialists only about Western imperialism, like what they consider as Western, like they would criticize like the United States, UK, like whatever, but Russia is okay, right? Like there are those, like we all know those people. So I mean, and like I don't know, like there are plenty other examples like of like I mean the Ottoman Empire and so on. So like the point is that
By the way, anecdote, last week I was sitting with my Dutch friend at a
Mhm.
cafe, and we were just talking, and she was, because of the time, she was asking me all these questions about Israel and Zionism, and I didn't, the best I could to explain.
Mhm.
And I mentioned the Ottoman Empire, and she had no idea what I was talking about. She had never even
Oh,
heard the word.
yeah,
So I think what you're saying about, kind of being hyper focused on Western imperialism or
yeah,
European imperialism for that matter, or American slavery, right?
yeah,
Which is just like the tiniest little speck in the
yeah,
history of slavery, right? Then then yeah, it's if you don't even know what the Ottoman Empire is, you have no reference point for any other type of imperialism.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Like I mean, also if you mentioned like slavery, also the trans-Saharan, if I believe if I use the correct term, trans-Saharan slave trade, which was like not better, like it was like some would say like way worse, and like to a certain extent there are things which kind of continue regarding slavery. At least I would say in favor of Western countries that they showed some sort of regret,
yeah.
some sort
Yeah.
of
I mean, the contemporary discussion of slavery really focuses on a lot of Gulf countries, on
mm,
China, and that
absolutely.
doesn't seem to be a pressing issue,
Yeah.
people feel the need to react to and oppose. Um, Whereas, we've all kind of heard, the American take on reparations, for example.
Hmm. Hmm.
That seems to be something that everyone has an opinion on. And, again, for the sake of this conversation, it doesn't really matter if you're for or against or just want to have kind of remote intellectual discussion on it. But, we do have these kind of uh, uh, um, slavery normalizing societies today,
Yeah.
and no one says anything.
Yeah.
They're just
Yeah.
like, you know,
Absolutely. I mean,
it's over
like
there, it's happening
people.
there.
Yeah. I mean, people quote like Al Jazeera on human rights issues. That says a lot, like a Qatari like dictatorship, which also involved like in something that some people would consider slavery and so on and so on. Like and like yeah. I mean, all this is like. Is true. Like it's beyond like kind of hypocrisy. But I would also like even in the like those who hate the West. This is the point that I want to make. That even those who hate the West, they still don't have the same standards even to America, like in the sense that if somebody is American, they wouldn't assume that like this American person holds like, I don't know, is
Voted
like
for Donald Trump.
exactly. And in
Yeah.
the past, like yeah, like there was like specifically Bush, because I would give an example of Bush because Bush like literally like promoted like taking over another country, like a few countries, invasion of other countries. And I think that if you look at American history, it's pretty clear that overall, like anything that America did, like the United States did, is way worse than anything that Israel did. Like anything that Israel is being accused of, America did like way larger scale. And still, people will not like demonize Americans as you know generally. Even when they criticize American policy, even now, and they would call America so and so, and would say like they would say horrible things about American policy, they would not say this about American citizens, and like, or will say that they're legitimate targets, or imply that they're legitimate targets, or all that.
Well, yeah, I think what you're saying really speaks to the problem with modern day anti-Semitism
Mm-hmm.
and the unwillingness of so-called critical intellectual voices, throughout the West to acknowledge that. Um, uh, and I think in Europe you hear more criticism of the US.
Mm-hmm.
Europeans naturally don't necessarily align with the US and don't
Yeah.
see themselves as, shall we say, natural
Right.
partners or to every decision that's made,
Sure.
in the US. I think also there is this feeling of um, the US has so many of its own kind of internal and external problems. It's such a huge monster, right? Because that's what it means to be a global power. Is you just become a monstrous entity in people's minds, right? That
Yeah.
on the one hand it is responsible for so much good, but also for so much, evil in some people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
Not in my mind,
Yeah.
for what it's worth. Um, that it then also becomes a reference point for you to define yourself by opposition to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in Europe that's a big thing. A lot of people think of the US as this kind of crazy, Wild West,
Yeah.
Donald Trump loving, sort of greedy, sometimes bloodthirsty superpower.
Uh-huh.
But they don't award the same description to a place like China or Russia, for that matter, right?
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
well, I would say it depends who, right? Like, I think we're talking more about like the far left. I think the average European maybe will still be afraid of Russia and like China, or maybe I'm wrong. Like, do you think something else like regarding that?
it's very hard to generalize, but definitely you hear a lot more brave anti-American rhetoric than you ever hear.
Yeah.
Anti-Russian or anti-Chinese.
Uh-huh.
And of course, absolutely no recognition of any other sort of attempt to gain power from countries like Turkey, like
Uh-huh.
Iran, countries that are really on the move, right?
Yeah.
Um, so so it's always I also think it's so easy to criticize the US because
Uh-huh.
it's more accessible to us, because it's in English,
Yeah.
so we don't need a translator, right? Because it's on the TV.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I, I would think like, there is some like, I would say something like this. Usually like all these authoritarian countries like have better propaganda, because as a democracy it's very hard to make a coherent propaganda when you have few factions fighting each other and it's very public. You have like
That's
the Democrats criticize the Republicans and so on.
yeah, that's
Uh,
a great
uh, yeah, so and like they have like consistent propaganda which flows into, especially like through the far left. And we know that, like, for example, Russia, like there were found traces of not only supporting the far left in countries but also the far right, like in many instances. So you have this, like, like proto-fascist far right, which suddenly, they have their own views, and then oops, and we also support Putin, by the way. And also same thing with like the far left, which for like decades, even before, like, Soviet Union, like, and so on, were supported by the Soviet Union and also China, of course, and all these things, be it directly or not directly, or like ideological connections and so on. So I mean, that's a factor.
Yeah, and I think with Israel, especially there's quite a short memory.
Mhm.
A lot of people who are critical of Israel also align it with the U.S.
Mhm.
and of course, the U.S. is its greatest ally, but the American-Israeli relations are quite new in recent history, and they're not, let's say, um, they're not completely void of struggle and internal struggle and criticism. uh, we also just saw it now in this past year with the Biden administration, of course, this kind
Yeah,
of hot and cold
yeah,
relationship with the Israeli government. um, but if we look back, I mean, there was very much a possibility for the Soviets to become a kind of uh, uh,
patron.
yeah, exactly, a kind of patron of Israel. We know that before that, of course, the British were the
Yeah,
patron, or at least tried to be for a
uh,
moment.
arguably, yeah, it's
So,
arguable. Yeah.
there is also this narrative which doesn't get shopped around enough, which is to say that really the Jews and ultimately the Jews that became Israeli
Uh-huh.
in Israel were constantly seeking the protection of a local, or not a local, but rather a superpower. And that
Yeah,
could be a regional one at the time of the Ottomans, or it could be a superpower on a more global scale, like the USSR
yeah,
and eventually the Americans. So I also think that when you say something about Israel being a colonizing
hmm
force, I mean, there's no point to even go into that. It's so easy to call bullshit on that. But then you really have to kind of wonder what kind of colonizing force ends up kind of bouncing
yeah,
around between superpowers that align with its mission,
yeah,
and then don't, and then you have to find a new patron.
yeah.
Uh,
I'm. Mhm. I mean, like, about colonization, I think that first of all, like, people use this term like, like it became kind of a, like, it became like really a word that is like only this specific negative thing. Now colonization can be interpreted in other ways as well. For example, when we say colonize Mars, we don't say like kick out like Mars indigenous
Martians.
population. Yeah, like colonization is also like settling. So I would say that like there is an element of that as well. And let's be also honest, like there were like things that were made by the state of Israel, by the all the like in the history there were things that were done which were not very good. Now like, I mean, again, like what you mentioned, like there is no country that was based, like, okay, there are some, but like I would say that majority of countries really like they didn't appear like from some sort of like like peaceful resolutions and all that, and there were a lot of misbehaviors, like crimes and so on and so on involved in
Or
that.
just wars. I mean,
Yeah,
borders of countries in modern day Europe were defined by naturescapes and
Yeah.
defended by wars.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, in political science, we like one of the things that we say what defines a country, a state, is a monopoly over power, because the state, like when you have you do not allow militias to decide, like, to take control and do, or mafias and so on. Like the state, like how much competent the state is like how much it can preserve a monopoly of power. Monopoly of power does not come without violence and without like certain things. And all the states, like, I mean, France is like enforced like Paris dialect and Paris, like, I don't know, like I will not go into the details. Also, I'm not like less experienced, like have less knowledge about this specific case, but I do know that there was like the dialect which was enforced over all France, and in many other countries as well. Like there were like kind of the center, usually the capital, enforces like their own culture and their own thing on places that might have had like different kind of identities, different like kind of
I
choice.
I don't think anyone is saying that colonization doesn't exist.
Hmm.
I mean, I'm left-handed, and if I was born 90 years ago,
Yeah,
I would have been forced to use and train my right hand.
me too. By the way, I'm also
Hey,
left-handed.
Leslie. So I don't think anyone's trying to say that colonization is not, an actual phenomenon in history and,
Yeah.
in modern day geopolitics,
Hmm.
or that it never involved violence and
Hmm.
horrific violations, right?
Yeah.
But I do think it's anachronistic to attribute to the inception and foundation of the State of Israel conventions that we recognize and try to maintain today, but no one was maintaining 75 years ago.
True. True.
Those
True.
conventions do not exist.
Yeah.
It's not to let anyone off the hook. It's just to say you're not having an intellectually honest conversation.
Of course.
Atrocities were committed 75 years ago
Yeah.
throughout the world. And,
Yeah.
you know,
I mean.
that was just a fact. And
Yeah.
so many countries were established in those years post World War II under similar conditions, you know.
Multiple examples that you could give, like, I mean, like also Cyprus and as well as India and Pakistan, and like even Poland, was like the border. Poland is not the same Poland that was before. It was created, like territories were taken from Germany, given parts of Poland to Belarus. By the way, my family originally from Poland, and they were like from territory that was annexed to like from Poland to Belarus. So I mean, all these things are
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like, so like all the borders are like that. And I specifically about Israel, I read like one a quote of like I forgot his name, but there is like a professor who like specializes on Israel specifically, like he's not an Israeli, but he's like kind of an expert on all that. And when he discussed like Israel and etc., he said that in the interview that he said that Israel has kind of both colonialist elements and like post-colonialist elements, like in the sense that there is this, very like, there is like this anti-Israel talking point that says like Israel is like a colonial settler enterprise, and then there is the like the Zionist Hezbollah point, which would say that no, we are indigenous people who are like reverse the colonization and bring and so on. The truth is kind of like maybe in the middle,
Yeah,
because it's also there are elements that were taken from like colonial kind of aspects, and like colonization in the sense also like bringing like settling the country, uh, like I mean also the British rule over Palestine back then played a part in allowing that. So there is this part, but there is also the connection which you cannot ignore. Like you cannot speak about like the connection of Jews to Israel in the same level as like the French had in Algeria, right? Like the French who came to Algeria.
It's, it's super interesting. I've never heard this articulated in this manner, that there are colonial and anti-colonial elements to the inception of Israel. I think it's not, there is truth to it, but it's not how I would put it, because I think, if anything, I would suggest that it is a case study in the difficulty of, this is especially relevant to today and to a lot of progressive thought. It kind of demonstrates the difficulty of empowering indigenous populations that have, almost gone extinct, with their dead languages and lost cultures.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really demonstrates how difficult it is to reintroduce a population to its historic land. And I'm thinking of, for example, indigenous Native Americans in the US. I mean, my mother was born in Chicago. The mascot of her high school was a Native American, right? There was a lot of pride in having this Native American man mascot. But at the end of the day, I don't know what tribe's land that school was built upon, right? There were no Americans. So it's great that you have this kind of moment of, you have a kind of poster boy for indigenous rights, but in practice, you would have to demolish the school and build a bunch of teepees, on the land instead. I'm sorry if that's an insensitive remark. I'm not
no, I mean, like,
history and culture, but I think what happens with Israel is you see a population of refugees who are persecuted everywhere they go, returning to their ancient historic homeland, reviving the language of their holy scripture, wanting to really share the land. We know that the Zionist Congress, for years, debated on what is the vision of Israel? What is the Zionistic vision? And it was always a collaborative vision that included Arabs and Jews together in Israel, and almost using this collaboration to kind of shine a light upon the world. So, and it was supposed to be different from European culture. It was meant to be different from Europe. It was meant to be, native, indigenous. So, of course, there's going to be a challenge with, trying to introduce the state of Israel as more than an idea, putting it into practice. So I don't think it's true to say it's colonial and anti-colonial. I think if anything, it's a wake-up call to a lot of groups that today believe in indigenous rights but don't really know how to make that work. I think it's not a mistake that, or rather, it's not by chance that Israel is the only example in existence of indigenous people thriving, going back to their ancient historic homeland, reviving their dead language. It should have been an example for other groups, but it's never happened. And there seems to be no artificial way to make it happen. So I think if anything, it kind of shows that it brings forth some questions on the validity of these ideas for other groups in the world. not in the sense that Israel isn't valid, but that there is a price to pay, and it can be a painful price.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I think like we all see also what's going on in the recent events. This brings it up to basically I think the 7th of October. I'm very interested like how, because I had like an experience, a very different experience abroad, like during the time while it's still like, it's pre 7th October. I was already back in Israel when 7th October happened. I had like the Israel experience on that of that, and I'm pretty sure that you also had this experience from like talking with relatives. You still have like relatives in Israel, right? Like, and
Yeah, of course, my whole
friends.
life is in Israel. Yeah.
Yeah, and all family, and like, yeah, like, I mean, friends and so on. I mean, like, but like, I can only imagine how it probably felt like within, like, I mean, it's not to say that certain experience is like worse or better, but like, it's a different experience to be like a minority in a place, and uh, like, how's like that, this vulnerability that you might have felt during.
Vulnerability really is one of the key words I would use, and I think many Israelis would use, and Jews would use to describe the um, the feeling of the day of October 7th, and the days since. This new profound vulnerability that was never there before, not for
Mm-hmm.
me anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it it really did feel, um, no one knew how it would end,
Mm-hmm.
and that was terrifying. Um, and I remember at 12 o'clock Amsterdam time,
Uh-huh.
uh, I remember the daughter of the hostage, I think his name is Aryeh Ben Ami. I hope I have that right.
Mm-hmm.
He had called into the Channel 12 news studio. And like many other people that day who were phoning into the news, the news studios, she was just in a complete state of panic and hysteria. And she had just seen a video of her father being paraded on the streets of Gaza. She had seen this video on Telegram, and she was in a state of shock, and she was begging for help. Now, as soon as I'd heard this conversation she was having with the news anchors, I turned the TV off. And I put on my coat and I went outside for a walk in the neighborhood with my partner, because I had spent all morning, of course, glued to the screen and just in a complete state of disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we were walking around. It was a sunny but cold morning in Amsterdam. People were outside cycling. Parents were with their kids. Their kids were, children. Um, asking for things and buy me this, and I want to ride this, and I felt such a deep sense of alienation from my surroundings because
Mm-hmm.
I was gutted. I was checking my phone every 5 seconds. I was talking to my partner just to try to process things that cannot be processed, and I still haven't processed in more than a year. And everything else around us was completely normal. And everyone was happy. The world didn't stop. And what we've seen in the past year is no, the world hasn't stopped, in fact, and doesn't seem to care much about Israeli and Jewish lives. So that beginning of alienation from my surroundings, which I had never felt in my years in the Netherlands, that's really stuck with me, unfortunately. And I don't know what the future holds, but I hope I find a way around it. And I also hope that ultimately society changes enough and starts kind of bringing me in closer to you.
Hmm. I am like somehow without like really like experiencing it myself, it feels like a natural continuation of the experience that I felt abroad because I remember this specific feeling even though I like still felt like completely safe and all that back then and but like this feeling that you realize that you're a minority, and this is something that I heard from my parents, like from being minority in the Soviet Union, and being like you have this vulnerability of like okay, like if everybody like kind of what you described like kind of alienation feeling, it's like it's even a bit like better than the other feeling of like everybody kind of turning against you kind of thing and like I never experienced
I prefer to be alienated than be a target.
exactly.
And today it's very clear that Jews are targets. So
Yeah, it
yeah, we're gonna miss alienation for sure.
yeah. Look, I mean, like I've heard about cases of anti-Semitism before, but you know what? And like first of all, these cases were like I think like I saw like statistics about like it's like rise of 200 200 just
Percent.
like yeah 200% in like the thing with like anti-Semitism. Uh, so so basically, I think that this kind of feeling of that I heard from my parents of like this oh like when you're a minority somewhere and they have like this entire experience like kind of like built into them, and it's not something that I felt so much when I was like when I like I never like felt like okay, like we can talk about like online anti-Semitism or like some specific incidents, but not like something like living in a foreign country and all that. But I did feel this kind of vulnerability where you kind of realize that you're a minority, and yeah, like people can like you are in kind of this kind of precarious status, kind of like precarious situation where you would like like basically like you're not belonging to the majority of this place. So somehow also like a lot of things like I would feel like this kind of like suddenly also the desire to kind of do like the kind of identity which is like more Jewish is also kind of going to surface because somehow like you kind of because you're surrounded by people very different, you somehow uh, go into like looking for something kind of familiar, and suddenly I would find myself like looking for like oh where I wouldn't ever go to the synagogue in like like in the like in Israel, like unless like it's bar mitzvah for someone, like I really have to, right?
Yeah.
But suddenly I'm like, oh, where's the synagogue? Like, oh, where's like like the Jewish community center and all this kind of stuff. And you see the security there, and you see like the, I mean, you can see kind of this feeling just by the atmosphere, right?
This is outside of Israel, you mean? In
Yeah,
moments when you were living outside of Israel. Yeah.
exactly. And I mean, like, and then I just think like I see this continuation of this, like, just from like watching all these cases rising to 100% of like in like anti-Semitic cases. You can see like the protests and what's happening. Like, I think like some of the things where, uh, I mean like literally one of the things was like also they even like attacked like vandalized the statue of Anne Frank, I think. There
Yeah.
was like there were protests near, I think actually also in Netherlands there was like I read about a case where they had like there was one in the United States when they had like this kind of 7th of October memorial,
Hmm.
and you would kind of like and they went like to protest near the memorial against the memorial, and you
Yeah,
have, yeah, and there was a similar memorial, not a similar, a different memorial, but also a memorial in Netherlands. And I also read like about a case there as well. So there are people who literally will
yeah,
go, not specifically to criticize Israel, to go to criticize a memorial,
yeah,
or like to go to protest near a synagogue. I think it was in Los Angeles. They went to protest near a synagogue again, like for so. I mean, and the thing is, and I think that this is the, the kind of the hardest hit to this kind of perception, for me at least, how I perceived like being abroad before. I did feel like, oh, there are some like anti-Semites and so on, but and I've seen a lot of like once in a while, especially in France, like protests or like Palestinian flag or like anything like that. But I would somehow assume that the majority of them like were leftists who just like care about human rights, and they don't have, even if like the feeling might be that they have like something against me because I represent the occupation or something like that. I would feel like they would not, they still care about humanity and human rights, and then it was just a mask off issue, right? Like, I mean, uh, like I've seen this and I was like, what? Like, I couldn't understand it. I like,
from this is really the, even more so than the atrocities of October 7th, this has really been the life altering, life defining moment for me as an Israeli and a Jewish woman living outside of Israel. Um, the willingness and desire, even the passion with which the world has ignored Israeli and Jewish pain. And we also saw this with the attitude towards sexual crimes and rape on October 7th. The UN was completely silent about these revelations. And, it took months before a report was composed about the sexual violence of the day. Women's organizations have said absolutely nothing. More often than not, the Israelis have been accused of fabricating and lying uh,
mhm,
about these sexual violence atrocities. Um, and I think, to zoom out a bit, the world's attitude towards Israel and Jews and Jewish pain is really what changed a lot of my perspective on who I am in the world. Um, Beforehand, I never really thought of anti-Semitism as a real thing. Of course, I knew anti-Semitism existed on the far right. I knew about white supremacy. My grandfather was German, and he was born not too far from here. And he was the lucky one. He managed to escape as a boy in 38 and arrive in London as a refugee. By the way, not easy to be a German refugee in
mhm,
London in the years of the war and following. So, um, we always knew, I think, that existed. We knew about the skinheads. We knew about the neo-Nazis, right?
mhm,
We never really gave much thought to the anti-Semitism on the left.
mhm,
Um, I think it's been very clear that there is a lot of anti-Semitism on the left. It disguises itself as anti-Zionism and has these very sort of intellectual justifications for its existence. Um, but then you also have a lot of anti-Semitism coming from Islamist voices
mhm,
that, are neither left or right, but the left has more willingly embraced. Um, but I think the most troubling uh, uh, um, manifestation of anti-Semitism for me, even considering what happened in Amsterdam just last week.
mhm,
Of course, we're talking about the violence and what was dubbed the Jew hunt on the streets of
mhm,
Amsterdam. Even more disturbing than that, which was very clearly, perpetrated by young Arab men, has just been the anti-Semitism of the center, if you will, of the grown-ups and the adults in the room. And their anti-Semitism is even more sophisticated because it hides behind words like liberalism and equality and not wanting to protect one minority at the expense of another, or all these kind of, very inspiring ideals. But
Mhm.
what you discover is in that arrogance and a complete unwillingness to say anything of substance and do anything of substance to change the climate in which a Jew hunt can happen on the streets of Amsterdam.
Mm.
So I think that's the most troubling, to really see this overarching lack of recognition of
Mm.
Jewish pain, of anti-Semitism. Um, yeah, because you cannot change what you don't recognize.
Mhm.
And people who have historically hated Jews, if that's on the right or on the left, you're not going to persuade them. You're not going to change them. History eventually will have to change them. But there's no rhetoric, there's no talking point, there's no hug and embrace that you can give them, that will change what they think. But it's more the adults in the room, the intellectuals, the politicians, the decision makers, the policy makers,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
government.
Uh, okay. Yeah. That's a good point. Even though I think like okay, like the Netherlands government right now is kind of like on, with the exception of the mayor of Amsterdam, I guess, but like it's kind of right now more on the right. That's right.
Well, I
What
think
they're.
the mayors of all the big cities are, the
Yeah.
cities are liberal, of course, but
Mhm.
as we know, Geert Wilders
Uh,
won an overwhelming a
Major.
vote. He got around 25%, if I'm not mistaken, of the vote. And if you look at the map of the Netherlands, the different districts, you really do see how the cities were liberal and everything else leaned right towards Geert Wilders. Yeah.
Do you feel to a certain extent that it might like be backfiring in the sense I will explain how. Like for example, my feeling was that at least if I looked at, like at American politics, and again I'm not American, I'm just following the stuff. I've seen like at least the more centrist Democrats, those who are not traditional, because there are Democrats who are traditionally supporting Israel or like very pro-Israel relatively, and you could hear them in any case. But those who were like kind of in the middle, who didn't have a clear opinion, so not to there is obviously the far like ultra progressives who are like socialists and so on in the Democratic Party who are very very much against, and those who in the middle are kind of like go with the wind kind of thing. And it felt like during Trump, they would be more critical towards Israel than like the centrists in the United States. Like this is my feeling. Maybe I'm wrong, but they were more critical of Israel than they would be during Biden. Because they kind of want, because Biden took a certain position over Israel, they would be like, oh, like we will go with Biden because we don't want to kind of like uh, you know
You
uh,
don't eat where you eat.
yeah, exactly. And do you feel like this in like regarding, for example, the centuries that you discussed, like in Netherlands, that you feel that because Geert Wilders is like so much pro-Israel and they need to be in opposition to him, so it kind of pushed them to a kind of more anti-Israel because they need to kind of be in opposition to that?
No, I don't think so. I,
Uh-huh.
I I don't think it's a reaction to Wilders' victory.
Hmm.
I think it's um, so. I think there's two things here that we need to consider. Um, One is that Wilders is pro-Israel, but he's not the only pro-Israel force in Dutch politics or society, right?
Hmm.
There are Christian movements in Dutch society which are very pro-Israel. We also have to remember a time where it was very common for Dutch volunteers to come to Israel and volunteer at kibbutzim.
Hmm.
You didn't have to be Jewish for that. So actually, a lot of the older generation, people who are now in their 60s, but also younger, right? So in their 50s and 60s, and yeah, they have a very good and positive memory of Israel,
Yeah.
and that also made them, pro-Israel. So you can be it's not so much that.
Yeah, but sorry for interrupting you, but the
Yeah.
kibbutzim I would more consider maybe a kind of a leftist thing, like in the sense that they went because of like kind of socialist values. And there was a period, I think in the 60s and so on, even like I mean, Bernie Sanders went to volunteer in the kibbutzim, and it was like this kind of when Israel was like trendy on the left, like the left were seeing Israel as like this leftist paradise maybe, or like as an example of something. It was short, but it existed for a while. So would you consider, or you would still like say that those are like kind of centrists as well who went there, kind of?
Uh, it's hard for me to say because I'm not an expert on this topic. I definitely don't think you had to be a leftist to volunteer at a kibbutz. I think there were many
Uh,
motivations to do that. One was, of course, if you think of the Six-Day War victory, right? That really generated a huge amount of curiosity around Israel. This project in the Middle East. Um, there was, of course, this myth of the IDF as this incredibly strong, able, cunning, and of course, victorious army.
mm,
So I think there was also just a desire to be near that, to be close to that, uh, and 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 sort of witness this tremendous growth, right? This kind of growth in the desert. That was the perception, I think. And I again, I
okay.
don't think you had to be a leftist to want to be close to that.
Uh,
Um, Also, if we think of the Netherlands as a social welfare state, which it was, and there is still a very, very strong social welfare foundation in this country today.
mm,
Um, so, you know, there was, I mean, there was some kind of, it did correspond, but it wasn't
mm.
exclusive, shall we say.
Yeah, yeah, I understand.
But about centrists sort of not really taking a stand or first of all, I should mention before I reach my point that past week has seen a lot of centrist and also left-leaning parties in government speaking out against the Jew hunt in Amsterdam. And
Mm,
with that, also bringing up issues with migration and integration. So that's just a side note. We can talk more about that. But
mm,
um, other centrists, shall we say, not taking a stand, I think that really boils down to anti-Semitism. I think that if you don't loudly advocate against harming Jews, by default, you are okay with harming Jews. And that is the issue. And anti-Semitism, as we know, as we've heard in the media many times, is a shape-shifting virus. And it's very hard to get people to admit something that masks itself so well in other justifications and excuses. Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway.
The silence, that's true, that I also felt like this as as a hurting part. The silence is sometimes like even like this kind of like easy approach as like kind of gaslighting approach of like
Absolutely.
that
Absolutely. Gaslighting is the word. Yeah.
what like anti-Semitism? There's no anti-Semitism. Everything. Look, Jews are protesting there, like, and literally, I think like in this protest, like I've seen like have you seen these pictures of like those who hold these signs of like now you understand why the stones and the trees will speak? This
Mm,
hadith.
yeah.
If you
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe some of the listeners will not know, I might put it in the description, but there is like this kind of hadith which talks about like when in the end of days the Jews would be like kind of there would be like this apocalyptic war and Jews would be hunted down like
And
and
only one type of tree
uh
will
yeah,
be the protector of any Jew that hides behind it.
I need to check,
Um,
need to remember the tree
and the
for
other and the other trees and even the stones would
yeah.
tell, if there was a Jew hiding amongst them. So even they would turn on the Jew. Yeah, that's
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, they have this kind of protest, they have this kind of things in protest. Now, there is complete quiet about this. Like, the thing is that they would say that there is nothing like, those are people protesting for human rights. And then you have these kind of things. And like just they would completely say nothing about that, completely like, oh, like no comment about that, like not even about these specific signs about like going to protest near like a synagogue, I mean with the exception like Biden and all that, like top kind of officials would say something, but those who defend those protests, they would say like, oh, like we don't see anything wrong, they just like it's in your imagination, it's like nothing wrong in what we see. Like there is this like kind of, I wish like I would respect way more their position if they would at least kind of like try to. I would have seen like a genius attempt to kind of push out these extreme elements and to say like, listen, you're not part of us. We condemn you, despise you. We don't want anything connected with you. Instead, they would go like, "What? I don't see anything. Like, what's wrong? Like, look, we have Jews. Look, like you see an addition, but we have Jews. That's like cancel it immediately, right? Ignoring the fact that many of those Jews are also like, I mean, like,
Yeah, I'll give you a few examples, kind of relating to a previous point you brought up about memorials and protests. So a month ago, the October 7th massacre was commemorated in Amstelveen, which is just south of Amsterdam, and it has a large Jewish and Israeli community. And it was commemorated in the center of town at a square. There was a ceremony, a stage with a microphone, and they also had a model of a Hamas terror tunnel,
mhm,
so the public could go in and experience that for themselves. And there were articles in the local newspaper saying, like, is the town square the appropriate place for this memorial? And at the end of the day, it was just a bunch of Israelis and Jews with flags singing really sad songs.
uh,
And I think the ambassador spoke also, but for all intents and purposes, it was not a political
yeah,
gathering. It really was about mourning and commemorating a year that had passed. And in the same square, you have the very large Indian community of Amstelveen that celebrates Diwali, right, or Holi, and you have
uh,
posters all over the city inviting people to take part in these, beautiful cultural celebrations, right? And
yeah,
that's never an issue, and it's never protest and question. So
yeah,
that's something that really annoyed me. Um, Now, the other thing, which I don't know if it was widely reported in Israel when it happened, but a few months ago, the Holocaust Museum was opened in Amsterdam. President Herzog was also invited to be one of the people present. And the mayor of Amsterdam, who I am no fan of, approved a protest, a pro-Palestinian protest on the same street, basically just across from this museum, resulting in dystopian and disturbing images of Holocaust survivors with their granddaughters or even great-granddaughters, young girls, kind of walking across this line of protesters held back by a barricade, being spat on and booed and yelled at on the way to the opening ceremony of a Holocaust museum.
Yeah.
There's also a video which I saw, which was very disturbing, of the mezuzah being put ceremoniously on the entrance, installed on the doorway, the entrance of the museum, with the King of the Netherlands, Willem, helping a Holocaust survivor put it on the doorway, and the only thing you can hear are the boos in the background. So, even before anything else, I think when you have a mob of people booing at the King of the Netherlands, that requires some thinking, some reflection. But, it's so disturbing. So I absolutely see a line between, Holocaust survivors being booed at by pro-Palestinian activists and gangs of men hunting for Jews on the street of Amsterdam. So, yeah.
That's, by the way, that's
And I should mention when the mayor of Amsterdam was asked about this and confronted with this, with her decisions, she always reverts back to the right to protest is a sacred right, whether she agrees with it or not. So this whole idea of making tactful decisions, of assessing risk, right, of balancing the rights of different groups in the society, right? So what holds more value? Allowing people to demonstrate, which they can do every single day of the year in any place, more or less, in Europe, right? What holds more value? That, upholding that, or allowing Holocaust survivors to not be spat on, on the streets of Amsterdam? And it seems that there constantly are excuses made for why people are allowed to behave badly when it comes to Jews and Israelis. And that annoys the hell out of me.
Yeah, it's interesting, by the way, because it does, like, I'm sorry for always like making parallels to American like politics, but like I wonder how much in Amsterdam there is like this kind of discussion of like freedom of speech and like hate speech in like the leftist circles or like the more progressive circles, because like I remember also this kind of absurdity watching like the heads of universities like back in the American parliament like couldn't answer simple questions and basically trying to defend their actions by freedom of speech, which they usually would in other cases like would prefer to sacrifice when there is a speech which offends other groups. Like like there were a lot of like right-wing speakers who came to the universities and were disallowed because there was a lot of protest about people get offended by what they have to say, even if it's not like technically a hate speech. Like I can understand if there is like a hate speech which like the kind of the limit of the speech is like when you incite for violence, you incite for like certain like kind of like conspiracy theories about people. You inspire like
Yeah.
all these kind of things. But
But let's not forget that President Ahmadinejad was invited to speak in Colombia, right? So, you know, excuse me if I don't go with the definition of what is hate speech by
uh,
people who, if I don't allow people who hate Jews
yeah,
define for me what is hate speech against Jews.
yeah, I mean exactly, but that's the absurdity because somehow, I mean, like that's the question, like that suddenly they do care about free speech when it is against Jews, when it is like when it fits like their source of narrative, when it like offends other groups, then you have limits.
Exactly, but you know, you care about women's rights until it's Jewish women being raped by Hamas
Mhm.
terrorists, and you care about crimes against humanity, but you have nothing to say about, you know, people being beheaded in their beds, you know, and all of their property being looted, and whoever survives being taken hostage across the border into a terror tunnel and you know, spat on by innocent civilians, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so there always is a double standard, and a society that allows a double standard is a sick society.
That's true. Did you feel this kind of thing also exist in? I know that you're not in the university there right now, right? Like you're not so much, but did you hear about things like that, or less so, like in Netherlands, like the things in the US that there are like people who are like, for example, let's say were there cases where here to Wilders was invited somewhere and so on, and wasn't.
No, Geert Wilders, as far as I'm aware, has constant security measures around him.
Mm.
So, as far as I'm aware, his address is not known. He has security people
Oh,
constantly
yeah.
surrounding him because there are fatwas against him. So,
Uh,
he is, you know, not, he is in real danger. There are constant threats on him, and it's not new, and it has nothing to do with Israel.
mm,
Um, so, Geert Wilders would not be invited to any university
uh,
anytime soon. He does not fit the bill. Um, but you know, there were attempts to start encampments in universities in Amsterdam. There were a few
mm,
very violent days, fires being lit, Jewish students being attacked. Suddenly, you saw all these middle-aged men walking
mm.
onto the campuses wearing kafiyas, you know, cussing people, hitting people. So yeah, make of that what you will.
Yeah, I mean, we do know that like literally Hamas people speak about like and like I'm even in Iran as well. They speak about I think Khamenei also, but also Khaled Mashal mentioned like how they like it's part. First of all, Khamenei congratulated. Like just think about like the absurd of Khamenei congratulating these protests. Yeah,
Students,
like
yeah.
when he smashes the protest in his own country in his universities. But like then you have like.
You know the meme. It's like a you know, it's just a thing that lives on the internet. This
Uh,
phrase, uh, "Satan is happy with your progress."
uh, didn't know that, but yeah, it fits so it fits
And
like
also, it's so literal, right? Literally, Satan is happy with your progress. Like,
yeah,
thank you, whoever made this, you know, years ago on the internet. Like,
that's true. That's true. Even though for him we are like the little Satan, and there is like the big Satan as well. And I mean the like it's amazing how literally it is a part of their strategy. Like I mean, like Khaled Mashal specifically talked about this as example. You know, he's like thing that he said that Israel has like strategic losses, but Palestinians have tactical losses. Like besides besides the fact that like this is tactical loss, everything that happened, this is what he considered. But the fact that strategic, what it means is exactly this kind of protests and this kind of image that like being promoted. And I remember there was this interview with I think it was like there was this like West Point strategist who's like he actually like a big supporter of Israel, and he said something like how much like the whole like this political pressure in the campuses and everywhere else is so much like part of their strategy because they knew that they cannot hold over time, but they were hoping that the pressure from outside will eventually, and that's why they would have to maximize, like like to make it as much as possible, people to create a situation where the majority of like
Yeah, but I think
maximum
also, but
casualties.
I think that's also banking on pre-existing anti-Semitism, something I like to remind people, which doesn't get discussed enough. Again, I was never really aware of anti-Semitism until this last year. Even though I had my own personal family history of persecution, on my mother's side, the Americans, of course, they fled the pogroms in Eastern Europe, and my grandfather on my father's side being German and fleeing to the UK. I never considered that history of persecution as part of my narrative. I think many Jews and Israelis don't. They don't consider themselves victims. We don't think of the people who arrived to Israel after World War II as refugees. We don't think of them as broken people, also from the Arab countries in the Middle East, people who were basically, persecuted and not allowed to return home. So even though we don't think of ourselves as victims, it is important to be aware of the history. And in terms of public opinion outside of Israel being a deciding factor for what the Israeli government, let's say, decides to do, I think that really banks on this history of anti-Semitism. So if we think of Europe, Europe has spent more years than not being anti-Semitic. I was over Christmas last year. I had traveled back to my grandfather's hometown in Germany, and we had also then decided to spend some time in the Alsace-Lorraine region, and we were going through these beautiful, picturesque villages in the French countryside, and every single village, of like 1,000 people, tiny little places on the side of a mountain somewhere, had I would kind of raise my head and see a street sign, Rue des Juifs, one of these
Yeah.
little tiny medieval villages, and that was the medieval ghetto,
Oh
right?
yeah,
And I
absolutely.
was in Strasbourg and had learned while I was there, because I had seen all these like Juif all over the place. I had learned that there was a huge massacre of the Jews of Strasbourg, where I think 6,000, I hope I'm not mistaken, but 6,000 Jews
Yeah,
in 13 something were
yeah,
burned over 6 days in the city.
yeah.
So I think if anti-Semitism is such a part of your cultural and historic DNA, and you've only learned not to be anti-Semitic in the last 80 years, you're gonna slip up. It's not. It's not. It's not. It's not a second nature just
Yeah,
yet,
yeah.
right? And that, I think, is also what we're seeing in the inability to condemn violence against Jews, in the willingness to ignore the
Uh,
pain of Jews and Israelis. So yeah, I think there's still a long way to go.
I mean, like that's a very interesting point. I
Unloving
also,
Semitism. Yeah.
yeah, the thing is that like often when people talk about this kind of like these like people view, like even when they accept the fact that like basically Israel was created by refugees who came from, like they usually put the like kind of the attention to Europe, even though like more than 50% now are Mizrahi from like the Arab world and all that. But and we have Ethiopians and so on and all that. But like uh, like they always like bring that like of, oh, it's only the Holocaust, like okay, like, oh, just like okay, like 6
No.
million, yeah, like was killed and that's it, and like so little people
Do
aware
they
about.
do they talk about the Farhud, for example?
Yeah, for who it's pretty unknown, like a
Do
lot of
they
people.
do they talk ever about the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Northern Africa and from the Middle East and from
Yeah,
Yemen?
yeah, it's true, it's true. All these things are true. By the way, for our listeners who or like our audience who don't know about the Farhud, these are basically pogroms that were like happened in Iraq and were orchestrated, by the way, with the help of Germany actually, but and with the help of um, certain certain what's his name, like Amin al Husseini, right? Like this was also one of the instigators.
The Fa-
uh,
the Farhud, it's in Iraq, but also in Iran, right? Or am I mistaken?
I think only in Iraq, I think
Or maybe
only,
I, yeah.
but there were, it wasn't the only, like there were like there were massacres, but even, I mean, like when we look at Europe, like people think that like anti-Semitism started at the Holocaust. Like they think like very few like people heard about the pogroms, right? But they don't associate it as a thing. Like people don't understand like the level, and usually don't like. I mean, uh, it's true that the Holocaust was horrible and like was like the kind of the big explosion eventually, but it wasn't like it's like the anti-Semitism didn't start there, like didn't appear there. There were like tons of horrific massacres that happened like all over through history back, and like just like going through it, and you say like, how do people do not know about this? They only know about the Holocaust, and they're like, oh, it's just the Holocaust. Why? Like, do you need to create a state just for the Holocaust? Like, come
Right.
on, like get over yourself, you know?
So- And no one asks themselves how Jews arrived in Europe.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and I was talking to a colleague of mine the other day, and we were talking about vacationing in Italy, and I was giving them all these recommendations around Rome. And I said, oh, and if you go to the Roman Forum, you can also see the Arch of Titus, and that
Yeah,
depicts the Jewish slaves and the Jewish menorah
yeah,
brought, or rather taken, right, by
yeah.
the Romans. And this person had no idea what I was talking about, kind of like my other friend in the Ottoman Empire. So, uh, you know, people have no idea that
Yeah,
Jews were introduced to Europe initially as slaves,
yeah,
and throughout the Middle Ages were segregated, were required to pay taxes for their own protection, migrated constantly to places where they were allegedly safe
mm,
until they were persecuted there too and either killed or burned, like in Strasbourg, or
yeah,
exiled. And the Holocaust was only the most sort of contemporary, modern, and efficient way to get rid of Jews. But it
yeah,
was not new
yeah,
by any means.
yeah. I mean, like, I think to a certain extent we have this. There were a lot of discussions about a lot of mentioning within the like kind of Jewish community. I think like people who are not from there would not know, but about like Jews being kind of like having really bad luck in being in certain group. For example, like in the sense where it was in societies where it's not like the enemies were the revolutionaries, the socialists, or the Jews were the revolutionaries, the socialists. In socialist societies, they were the capitalists and like everything which is against the rule there. In modern day, at a time when being a minority was bad, like they were considered the non-white minority. Now they're considered white because it's like less, like it's kind of like less hype to be like there is this like oppression Olympics. So like Jews are now considered white and Europeans. My parents always were like kind of recognized as Jews by their looks, like physically, like they're like distinct kind of look, distinct genetics, distinct besides the culture and all that. That was like the language of Yiddish, which is a mixture of Hebrew and the German. But like the looks, like people could have tell the looks, like which is like very Jewish look. Now I was told many times that I don't look that much Jewish, maybe just the nose and so on. But I mean, I'm like at the
Lots of
time.
money, obviously, Tony.
Yeah, that's the point. But I mean,
Your
like,
love of money gives you away.
yeah, it's true, it's true, it's true. That's also, but but I mean, people were people now would say like, oh, you're a European right now. You're not a real Jew. Like the real Jews are like they would even say like the Palestinians or something like that. This is the popular thing right now to say that when it was like kind of like bad to be Jews, then we were Jews. But now when it's like considered like a thing to say that like our Jewish connection like gives us certain like let's say claim, even though I wouldn't say that only this would be a claim by itself, but they would like just want to take even that. They would say like, oh, you're not the real Jews. You're like Khazars who I don't
Yeah.
converted or
Oh
Europeans who
yeah,
converted.
well, first of all, I have to tell you something hysterical that I just found out, and my boyfriend had to explain to
Mm.
me. Just to set the record straight, my boyfriend is Yemenite,
Mhm.
and his father was literally born on a mountain in southern Yemen.
Wow.
So anyone who says Jews are white,
Mhm.
uh, you know, I dare you, I double dare you to look my boyfriend in the face and say you're white or a white colonizer.
Yeah.
Um, what I what I wanted to say about that is it really goes so okay. You've probably heard that a new study suggests that Christopher Columbus was
Oh.
Jewish.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So someone had mentioned on Bill Maher on his show, hey, what do you think about the fact that Christopher Columbus is possibly genetically Jewish?
Uh-huh.
And and the person said, I hope I'm not misquoting, something like, well, Bill, when you and I were, younger, Christopher Columbus was a hero, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He was this
Yeah.
brave traveler, explorer, whatever. And fast forward however many years, now that Christopher Columbus is considered in the US a
Yeah.
colonizer, right? An imperialist, someone who took away Native American rights and lands and whatever, and erased a culture. Well, now he's Jewish. So,
Yeah.
any
Yeah.
given moment, if there is any sort of evil in the world, you can count on the fact that it will somehow emerge as connected to Jews
Yeah.
or Jewish. So I don't think we should uh, see that as more than just plain old anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Uh,
to say a good
uh,
word.
yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's like it always happens, and like it's I don't know how to describe it besides like bad luck. And yeah, I also thought about like when I heard about this Columbus thing, I thought like this is not what we need right now. Like they're gonna blame that for us for that as well. And like by the way, those who claim that Jews are not real Jews and so on, as I said too, like in different discussion, like it's they would not take responsibility. Like if they really like
I
are like that,
tell you something about this. I forgot I was going to mention it. I said two
yeah.
points and I only mentioned one because I started thinking about my boyfriend. So of course I was
Uh-huh.
distracted. But I had just recently learned that in uh, some kind of, you know, anti-Zionist regimes, media, pop culture, basically. So in a lot of these kind of Muslim countries, um, there is a dissonance because Jews are, of course, mentioned in the Quran.
Yeah.
And how do you then connect,
Yeah.
the Jews as figures in the Quran with Jews living today in Israel who, represent everything you hate and you're committed to their destruction, right?
Mhm.
So there's this concept of Talmudic
Uh,
convert,
yeah.
which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
hysterical. And it's this idea that Jews living today are not real Jews, because it cannot be that these are the same Jews from the Quran,
Mhm.
but instead they're Talmudic converts, whatever that means.
Yeah.
But somehow we're all just posing as Jews. And,
Yeah.
perhaps the real Jews were extinct at some point, or they're, unaware of their own identities or whatever.
Mhm.
There's also these other versions, conspiracies that say that Palestinians today are the real Jews.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that kind of explains how, someone like Jesus was actually Palestinian.
Palestinian. Yeah. 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 But they also
And
wouldn't
also
take us.
means that, by default, that means Palestinians have the indigenous right to the land. That's also crazy because you recognize that Jews have the right to the land, but you don't want to recognize it's these Jews. So
Yeah.
you have to somehow transfer that to a different group of people you think are oppressed. And, it's just, it really is, you really can dive down this rabbit hole and just never make it out. Uh,
It never makes sense. Never makes
it's
sense.
it's humorous at best, but at the end of the day, like you mentioned before, it is part of a larger campaign that really banks on the fact that a place like Europe, for example, is steeped in anti-Semitism, and it's historic anti-Semitism in its DNA, in its roots.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't look to the last 85 years to say, oh, Europe is this great, enlightened,
Mhm.
progressive, liberal society.
Mhm.
Um, because unlearning anti-Semitism, the world's most ancient hatred, it's going to take more than 85 years, even with the best intentions. And I do believe a lot of Europeans, and within that, of course, a lot of Dutch people, do have the best intentions. But
Mhm.
the level of humility that has to come with wanting to unlearn something, you have
Mhm.
to really recognize your own failures, your own weaknesses, your own biases, right?
Mhm.
Um, and also be willing to listen to Jews
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
tell you
Yeah.
that something is anti-Semitic instead of finding justifications, which is what we saw in Amsterdam last week with the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. That was used as an amazing justification
Uh-huh.
for the Jew hunt, and you cannot justify it.
I mean, that was like so amazing to me. I exactly wanted to bring it up again because I mean, this whole thing. What's amazing to me. By the way, I would want like to just make a side note. I also have like some criticism to the wordings that like sometimes used like on like our side somehow, like that they would equate that to like complete like I would say that I would call it like mini pogrom. I wouldn't call it like really a pogrom.
Mhm.
I would, because what I see as pogrom is like like real murders and rapes and all that, and I understand that like what happened there is
I,
beatings.
I don't think I don't think we should define pogroms by the result, but by the intent, right?
What?
Because that's also what that's also the idea of, when you talk about the October 7th attack, was there genocidal intent
Mhm.
by the Nukhba terrorists
Yeah,
of Hamas? Yes, absolutely, there was genocidal intent, and just because they didn't manage to annihilate every Jew in Israel doesn't mean that it's less of a genocide.
yeah,
In
yeah.
that sense, I don't think we should discredit this word pogrom. I think the only difference is that in the past, pogroms, as we've seen in Eastern Europe, um, were even, let's say, supported by the authorities. They were seen as a means of venting frustration at times of economic
Yeah,
distress
yeah,
or social anxiety. So it was almost seen as like, oh, well, go let off some steam on the Jewish community, right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
And that's why they weren't stopped. So I think in this case, it wasn't a pogrom in that sense.
Uh-huh.
It's not like the Dutch authorities, went out and said, "Hey, go vent your
Yeah,
frustrations on a bunch of Israeli tourists." Um, but that's also why it's important to look at the larger context of this
yeah.
past year and how latent and um, apathetic the Dutch authorities have been to instances of Jew hate, anti Semitism, anti Zionism.
Mm,
They've allowed a lot to happen.
mm. I yeah, like I agree, and like to a certain extent as well, as it will sound like absurd, like that agree and disagree. But I still like like this is a position that you can take. I agree with that. Like it's not wrong. I just would say that like I think like the responsible exaggerated. I would tell you why, and I see it different from the 7th October, because in 7th October they like really like, first of all, there was the dead, it's true, and they also committed like a lot of horrible acts in like these attacks. Like it seems that it was like kind of hooliganism in the attacks in Amsterdam. They didn't The fact that they didn't kill anyone, it's not a point in their favor, because beating up someone is also not okay. But like it's not because of because I understood, like, correct me if I'm wrong, because from the coverage I understood that the Dutch police there was completely incompetent. Like it didn't protect anyone. Like it didn't. So it's not like the police stopped them and they didn't. They just like beat up people and nobody stopped them. They could kill people. They didn't kill. I don't think that we should give them bonus points for just beating up really hard, like beating up people really hard and hunting Jews. It's not. It doesn't make them like heroes or anything like that. But they're not like murderers, right? Like they didn't rape anyone. They didn't kill anyone, but they did beat up, which is also a horrible thing. So like
I, well, reading Dutch media in the days before
mhm,
uh, this happened, there were already alerts. The municipality and the police had designated certain areas to be more sort of high
yeah,
tension areas, and they declared uh, a kind of emergency situation there, giving the police extra rights
mhm,
and authority um, uh, uh, to, um, to stop people basically and frisk them,
yeah,
and we know that in the days leading up to this event, about 50 something people were arrested. These were not Israelis; these were local Dutch people, um, for conspiring to raise havoc on the streets of
oh,
Amsterdam. Now
okay,
we know in the past week that since May, There have been groups organizing through WhatsApp, through Telegram, through social media, to kind of lure Israelis and Jews, also using Palestinian symbols like flags to sort of enrage them
Mhm.
and basically provoke
Yeah.
Israelis and Jews, and then be justified in hitting back, shall we say. So I think that's a conspiracy. Um, and and just because this was the first phase or the first time this was allowed to take place in such a manner. So yeah, the first time they didn't manage to kill anyone,
Yeah.
but I want to wait around and discover what they're allowed to achieve the second time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like
What
it's.
what takeaways they've had and learnings from the first time. And we know that, in the days after, there were still people on the streets of Amsterdam looking for people who looked Jewish, and asking to see their passports.
Yeah.
Uh, it's not hooligans; it's people who take the law into their own hands.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah. So I don't think we should wait around and just kind of be thankful and grateful.
Oh, no, no, no. Yeah, of course. Like my point wasn't, yeah, my point wasn't in any case to minimize like the threat or to say like that like what they did is okay or like they're just
Yeah,
downplayed.
the issue also with the Dutch police has been that, allegedly the Shin Bet did contact the Dutch
Yeah.
authorities and warn them. And it was proposed, I don't know if this is true, I hope I'm not echoing a conspiracy, but it was proposed that perhaps there are people in, Dutch security forces who believe the same things that these gangs believed and
Mm,
didn't forward the message. We
mm,
know about a month or maybe 6 weeks ago, it was published in Dutch media that there were groups of policemen who had come forward to say they were not comfortable with providing security to Jewish and Israeli events and institutions in the Netherlands.
mm,
They felt like it went against their moral compass.
mm,
And not that they were afraid
mm.
of perhaps being targeted by terrorists, but instead that they really felt and believed that it was wrong morally to provide security services to a Jewish event or a
Mm.
Jewish school.
Yeah.
Um, and they were allowed. They were, posts were switched around to accommodate, these sensitive security officers, policemen, state funded, of course, right? And when it blew up, and of course there was a lot of shock around this, that's when the police commissioner had to come forward and say, no, this was wrong of us to try to accommodate these feelings, and
Uh,
police officers are only human, but yeah, of course. So this resulted in this insane reality where, a convicted pedophile is awarded more protection by the police officers accompanying them from the police car into the courthouse,
yeah.
or if they get beat up in jail, of
Yeah.
course, when someone really dropped the ball, right? Um, but they're awarded more protection than a Jew just out living their life, right?
Yeah.
Accused of nothing other than being Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, like, it shouldn't have had like you don't have to have like extreme, like some some like large percent, like very sophisticated, a very large brain to understand that. Listen, like you have this kind of match, and it could be at this kind of volatile period. Like it could be very dangerous. Like maybe you should put more security like definitely there was something there like that went
It's
down.
it's it's I think it's blissful ignorance.
Mm,
At best, it's
mm,
blissful ignorance, and at worst, it's something else that
yeah,
I don't want to accuse anyone of.
Yeah,
But
of
um,
course.
but
Of course. I mean,
we have to consider, that
it's yeah. But sorry,
no, that's
sorry.
it. It's a
Yeah,
possibility that unfortunately we have to consider, knowing what we know about the Dutch police now. Um,
yeah.
you know,
I think that the last point was that I would make about this is just that what like I think was most shocking about this, even like besides the police thing, it's a thing by itself that like it's horrible by itself, but literally people use these examples of like Jews, like Israelis doing like certain things as, oh, this explains why they did so and so, and this is a like legitimate excuse because it's not like they attack specific Israelis who try to rip off the Palestinian flag. They attacked
anyone
all
who's
Israelis
named
and Jews.
Jewish Israeli, yeah.
Yeah, it's I mean it's amazing because
There's no excuse.
I
There's no.
think yeah, I think when you like put it in reverse and you would say that like a Palestinian was attacked by because he tried to rip an Israeli flag or tried to rip like let's say like there were this, you remember the period when they ripped hostages, like pictures of hostages
Posters
and all
of
this.
hostages, yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I would like to see anyone like justifying this about like just like pogroming like the entire like I don't know, like the entire Arab community, or like I don't know
There
what.
were no gangs of Jews on the street hunting for pro-Palestinian,
Yeah,
protesters because they had ripped posters of Jewish babies taken hostage.
yeah,
Or and I think you and I both have grown up seeing plenty of instances of the Israeli flag being burnt, torn, stomped on, or
yeah.
worse. And it's just become, unfortunately, a regular thing that we're used to seeing on the news.
Mhm.
And still, there are no Jewish gangs or
Yeah,
Israeli gangs.
yeah, yeah,
So, again, it's this willingness to be sensitive and empathetic only towards a certain type of people. That's the double standard. And when you ask why is this double standard? Why does it exist? Um, so much just boils down to anti-Semitism.
or racism of lower expectations because they think like they are somehow less like, oh, they have less agency over themselves, they
Yeah,
less can control
I
themselves.
I
So
don't think it's fair to say that an Israeli flag is more triggering to, a pro-Palestinian or Palestinian in Amsterdam
yeah,
than a Palestinian flag is to an Israeli or a Jewish person, right?
yeah,
So it's not a question of how you feel. It's about what is the law. And the
yeah,
law does not permit, Israeli football fans to tear down a flag. And for those
absolutely.
instances, you have the local Dutch police.
Hmm.
And, it goes without saying that those people are also flying back to their country and they're not your issue anymore,
Yeah,
after a few days. But the real problem is the people in Dutch society who are here and remain here, who think it's legitimate to then take the law into their own hands and begin hunting for Jews. Um, and, that's an issue that the authorities have not really been able to address.
absolutely, absolutely. Mims, thank you so much for being a host on this podcast. It was a pleasure talking with you, as always, by the way. Like, it's you
Thank you so
always.
much. Thank you for having me. And, I'm glad we touched upon, only very briefly, a lot of different things, but um, I think it really goes to show that when you speak to someone you like,
No,
you can kind of spread your wings
that's true.
and speak freely also. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. We'll be in touch. Good night.
Good night.